I think that you all can tell that I'm something of a fan of the Irish, being Irish myself. The song that you have just heard is called Gary Owen. Gary Owen was an Irish song about the defense of the land that made it over with the Irish soldiers that came and joined the U.S. Army and the U.S. Cavalry, and it became the theme song of the United States 7th Cavalry, which was George Armstrong Custer's regiment. It remains to this day the theme song, the anthem of the 7th Cavalry, and it was the song that the 7th Cavalry sang when they went marching into Baghdad in 2003. A much different song was sung on the other side by the Native American tribes, or the American Indian tribes, or the Amerindian tribes. The names are really interchangeable now. It is not as big a deal as it used to be for the nomenclature, but the issues of the Indians continue. In this particular lesson, we're going to be focusing on the last stand of the Indians and the reason why they declined into the 1890s. We'll see the settlers in the West, and then the railroads, and then the immigrants in the West, and then finally the closing of the frontier. And there you see the picture of the quintessential Indian chief Sitting Bull, who was a Lakota Sioux chief. The last stand of the Indians. The major Indian tribes, or the Native American tribes, and I've considered the terms interchangeable. The Cheyenne, the Lakota Sioux, also you had the Dakota Sioux and the Sioux Confederation. When I say a confederation, this is an association of very highly civilized tribes. Leading among the Lakota was Sitting Bull and their great war chief Crazy Horse, and the picture to the right shows perhaps a picture of Crazy Horse. We're not exactly sure that it was of him. Both Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse fought the Plains War. These were wars against whites moving into Indian lands, especially the sacred Indian lands of South Dakota, the Black Hills region, where Mount Rushmore is located to this day. Whites moved along the Bozeman Trail, and Chief Red Cloud, among the Lakota Sioux, went after whites trying to settle in that area. As a result, the U.S. cavalry was sent out to tame the frontier, and they enacted a number of treaties and reservations. The Fort Laramie Treaties of 1868 set aside lands that were reservations for Indians only. Unfortunately, with the treaties, they probably weren't worth the paper they were printed on. The American government frequently tore up the treaties, rewrote them, always at the expense of the Indians. The other problem that the Indians had on the frontier was the decline of the buffalo. The Great Transcontinental Railroad actually split the buffalo herd in two, and the buffalo herd was no longer able to migrate north and south with the seasons, and as a result of this, the herd diminished almost to extinction. Since then, the buffalo has been brought back, but a major source of food and living for the Indian was deprived of them when the buffalo declined. More than 10 million buffalo were also slaughtered in the process, oftentimes by whites moving into the West to prove their manhood and to show that they were tough guys and to toughen them up, and they could go home and have a buffalo head hanging on their wall. The famous Wild West showman Buffalo Bill Cody himself killed more than 1,000 buffalo in his lifetime. The Plains Wars had several major incidents, including Custer's last stand. The picture on the right, you see him there, the famous George Armstrong Custer, one of the boy generals of the Civil War, who then moved out onto the plains after the Civil War, and he took with him a sense of his own invincibility. Custer was called the Son of the Morning Star because of his long, flowing, blonde, gingerish hair that he had. And there he followed General Philip Sheridan out to the plains. He was a brigadier general during the Civil War, but it was only a brevet rank. He was returned to his regular Army rank of lieutenant colonel when he went to the regular Army in peacetime. It's at the Little Bighorn River in Montana that he made a very foolish decision to split his forces, and his 200 cavalrymen were overwhelmed by several thousand Indians under the command of Crazy Horse, who, by the way, respected Custer quite a deal. When the bodies were recovered from the battlefield, Custer was not... his corpse was not mutilated at all, because for some reason he had cut his hair prior to the battle, and the Indians did not recognize him. The U.S. cavalry was defeated at the Little Bighorn, but it was not the end of the U.S. cavalry, of course. Crazy Horse was killed by the U.S. cavalry in 1877. In 1881, Sitting Bull surrendered. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Indian tribe, after having undertaken a long retreat and flight, finally in the dead of winter surrenders to General Nelson Miles, writing, "I will fight no more forever." The Indians were down, and they had lost what they believed was the glue that had held them together, their identity. But then there arose up amongst them a new movement called the Ghost Dance. They looked toward a Messiah, somebody who would rise up to lead them. And the Indians engaged in the Ghost Dance in order to call forward the spirit of the dead ghosts of the past, the dead warriors of the past, very much like the book of Ezekiel in the field of dry bones and the restoration of Israel. So the Lakota Sioux believed that they would be restored. And the U.S. government took a very strong stance against the Ghost Dance. And when it was believed that Sitting Bull, who had returned from his tour on the Wild West show, would join the Ghost Dance, well, then, unfortunately, a detachment of U.S. cavalry was sent out to make sure that he behaved himself, and in the ensuing scuffle, another Indian actually shot and killed Sitting Bull. The final nail in the coffin of the Indians was the massacre at Wounded Knee on December the 29th, 1890. A detachment of the U.S. 7th Cavalry Regiment that was commanded by Major Samuel Whitside intercepted Chief Spotted Elk's band of Miniconjou Lakota and Hunkapa Lakota near Porcupine Butte and escorted them 5 miles to the Wounded Knee Creek, where they made camp. The remainder of the 7th Cavalry, which was led by Colonel James Forsyth, arrived and then surrounded the encampment, and the regiment was supported by a battery of 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns, which are high-powered rifles. On the morning of December the 29th, the troops went into the camp to disarm the Lakota, and one version of events claims that during the process of disarming them, a deaf tribesman named Black Coyote refused to give up his rifle, claiming that he had paid for it. A scuffle ensued. Several Lakota drew their weapons to open fire on the cavalry, and both sides began firing indiscriminately. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 150 men, women, and children of the Lakota had been killed, and 51 were wounded, 4 men, 47 women, and children. Some of them died later. Some estimates placed the number of dead at 300. 25 soldiers also died, 39 were wounded, and 6 of those wounded later died. At least 20 U.S. soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor. In 2001, the National Congress of American Indians passed 2 resolutions condemning the awards and called on the U.S. government to rescind those Medals of Honor. The site of the battlefield is a National Historic Landmark, and in 1990, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, which was a massacre, both houses of the U.S. Congress passed a resolution formally expressing deep regret for the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek. And one of the best books to read about it is a book called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. That is the monument currently under construction to Crazy Horse in the Black Hills, not far from Mount Rushmore. You see in the foreground the model, the plaster cast model for Crazy Horse, and the actual cliff carving. It has run into financial difficulties, and progress has stopped as they look for more funding. I hope it is something that they complete. It will be a very worthy monument. As the Indians decline, settlers begin to move in, and the settlers contribute to the decline of the Indian. Cattle and sheep were the business of the first settlers in the West. The Great Plains offered great opportunities for grazing, and Chicago stockyards called to them. The cowboys were the ones that went out on the West. The image of the lone cowboy is very mythical. Cowboys were very gregarious about. They operated on what was known as the open range system, no barbed wire or anything like that, and the great cities of cattle and sheep, where they would get on the railhead from their great drives to the stockyards of Chicago, were places like Dodge City and Abilene. And when cow folks came in off of the drive and they had money in their pocket, they wanted to have a good time, and that meant drinking and gambling and women. And such cities like Dodge and Abilene and so forth became places of, shall we say, raucous behavior and maybe a wee bit of violence. And so they hired town tamers and gunfighters to the town to tame the town. And this is where you had, of course, Wyatt Earp, the famous Wyatt Earp, and James B. Wild Bill Hickok, who you see there in the picture. And Wyatt Earp's very good friend, William Bartholomew Bat Masterson was his name. Following the settlers in the West were sodbusters. They're called sodbusters because they dug up the Great Plains. The sodbusters are farmers. They're European immigrants who plowed the plains, and the plains are very dry. Their irrigation comes from rivers fed by mountain snows. Their irrigation is not from the rainfall. And the Great Plains, therefore, can be very dry, and plowing up the soil desiccated the soil. And year after year and decade after decade of plowing up the soil is going to have deleterious effects on the land. And finally, in the 1930s, the bill for that is going to come due in the form of the Dust Bowl. Let's go back to our friend Wild Bill Hickok. Does anybody know what hand he was holding when he was shot in the back and killed? It today is called the dead man's hand, and it is aces and eights. along with the cattle drivers and the sheep farmers and the pig farmers and the sod busters, came, of course,
with the cattle drivers and the sheep
I'm
farmers
a big fan
and the pig
of
farmers
the
and
old
sod
Western
busters
movies that they would
came,
show
of course, the
frequently on
railroads.
AMC. And one of my
I'm a big
favorite
fan
movies of all
of
time
the
is
old
How the
Western
West Was
movies
Won,
that they would show
which is a
frequently
epic
on
saga of a
AMC,
family.
and one of
as
my
it goes
favorite
from
movies
the
of all
settlement
time is
in
How
the
the
early
West
part
Was
of the
Won,
West, all the
which
way
is
out
a
into
epic
the
saga
far
of a
west
family as
and
it goes
into
from
California.
settlement
And
the
the early part of
railroad
the West, all the way out
scene is
into
one of the
the
great
far
scenes
west
of the
and
entire
into
movie,
California.
the Great Buffalo
And the
Stampede
railroad
and the building of the
scene
railroads
is one of the great
Well, the
scenes of the
railroads,
entire movie. The Great Buffalo
the art of
Stampede and the
civilization,
building
the
of the
pinnacle of
railroads.
civilization.
Well, the
was
railroads
considered to be that you had a railroad that
the
went from
art
coast
of
to
civilization,
coast.
or the pinnacle
The
of
Europeans
civilization
were
was
trying
considered
to
be
build
that
a
you had
railroad through
railroad
Africa
that went
from Cairo
coast
to the
coast.
Cape.
Well,
The
you get to
Europeans
see
were
such movies
trying
like The
to
Ghost in
build
the
a
Darkness
railroad
come
through
into
Africa
play
from
and so
Cairo
forth.
to the Cape.
For the
That's
U.S.,
where
it
you
was
get
to
to see
link
such
the
movies
Pacific
like The Ghost
to the
in the
Atlantic
Darkness
on
come
May
into
the
play
10th,
and so forth.
1869.
For the U.S., it was to link
Utah,
the Pacific
the first
to the Atlantic. On May the
transcontinental
10th,
railroad was linked
1869,
when
at
the
Promontory Summit,
Utah,
two
the
railroad
first
heads
transcontinental
met
railroad
north of
was
Salt Lake
linked
City.
when the
Jupiter
engine and
two
the
railroad
engine
heads
90
met
coming from the
north
east.
of Salt Lake City.
And the
As you see
Jupiter engine
today,
and
as
the
you drive
engine
along
90
interstates,
coming from
at
the east.
most interstate stops,
And
you'll see,
as you see
fast
today,
food
as you drive
restaurants,
along
hotels,
interstates,
and
at
lodges,
most interstate
gas
stops, you'll
stations,
see,
of course,
fast food
along the
restaurants,
railroads prior to
motels,
the
and
interstates,
lodges,
you had much of the same
gas
thing.
stations, of course.
Businesses opened up along
the
lines.
railroads
lines
prior
were
to
built
the
to
interstates.
access
You
built
had much of the
business,
same
but
thing.
they also
Businesses
created
opened
business
up along the
way.
lines. The lines
the
were
mining
built to
business,
access built
placer
business,
and
but they
hydraulic
also
mining,
created
that is,
business
a
along the
placer
way.
is in
You
the
had the
ground,
mining business.
hydraulic is
Placer
using
and
high-pressure
hydraulic
water
mining,
to
that is,
placer
blast away
in
the
the
rock.
ground.
Another
Hydraulic
great
is
movie,
using
and you can tell that I
high-pressure
love
water
movies,
to
is Clint Eastwood's movie
blast
Pale
away
Rider.
the rock.
Talks about
Another great
hydraulic,
movie, and you can tell that I love
mining.
movies, is
Clint
Eastwood's
movie
Butte, Montana,
Pale Rider,
or Butte,
talks
Montana,
about hydraulic,
was a city that basically
mining.
came out of nowhere because of the
Butte,
great
Montana,
mineral
or Butte,
reserves
Montana,
that were there.
was a city that
Outside of
basically
Carson
came out of
City,
nowhere
Nevada,
because of the great
Irish
mineral
diggers
reserves that were
found
there.
a small load
Outside
of
of
silver
Carson
that
City,
they
Nevada,
quickly began
Irish
to extract,
diggers found
thinking that they
a
would come to
small
the
load
end
of
quickly.
silver,
That
they
kept going,
quickly began
and they
to
kept
extract.
going. There was no end
Thinking
in
that
sight.
they would come to the
It
end
got
quickly.
bigger. It got
They
larger.
kept going.
It is still
and they
there
kept going.
today.
There was
And they
no
called
end
it
in
the
sight.
Big Bonanza.
It got
And that's where
bigger.
you get
It
the,
got larger.
It
old
is still
TV
there
series with the
today,
signature
and they
song
called it the Big
Bonanza.
Bonanza.
That's where you get the
old
okay,
TV series with its signature
You also
song,
had
Bonanza.
in California the growth of agribusiness.
California
Okay,
produces more.
You also
growing
had
things
in
than
California
any
the
other place
growth
in the
of
United States.
agribusiness.
And
California
it's from where we get
produces
a
more
large number of
growing
our
things
crops.
than any other
You have
place in the
lumber in
United
the Pacific
States.
Northwest.
And it's from where we
And
get
San
a
Francisco
large number
became
of our
a
crops.
major metropolis
With
as a
lumber in the
result
Pacific
of
Northwest.
the railroad. And San Francisco became a major metropolis as a result of the railroad. And here you see the railroad being built through the high snowy passes of the mountains. And if you look closely, you'll notice the headgear of some of these railroad workers indicate that they are Chinese. And Chinese were essentially hired off by railroad workers from the imperial family of Japan, would hire off its own people, not its own family, but its own people would actually hire off Chinese workers. And so Chinese workers came and built the railroad along with African Americans and European immigrants, all together built the railroads. And in many of the towns along the Transcontinental Railroad, you had Chinese settlements, China towns, and so forth. Here you see another picture of the Jupiter 8 and the Engine 90 coming to meet each other at Promontory Summit, Utah. And the site is memorialized to this day. And there you see the actual two engines where they met. In 1890, the United States conducted its census. It was its centennial census. It was the first census taken since, 100 years earlier, the first census was taken. And on this census, the U.S. government declared that the frontier was, quote-unquote, closed. That means that Western migration had reached the Pacific. There was no place more to go west on the continent. It also noted a 50% drop in the population of the Indians. War, disease, oppression had taken its toll. And so, a young man who's a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, whom you are reading about now, named Frederick Jackson Turner, came up with what was known as the frontier thesis. And the frontier thesis was this: that American democracy and capitalism was shaped by the frontier. That the frontier is this boundary layer that Americans move to, and there they learn the hard work and the individualism, rugged individualism that would make them into great American people of democracy. Many people said, this is a groundbreaking thesis. This is the ultimate thesis by which American democracy should be measured. Others said, excuse me, just one moment. Why is it always in the West that American democracy and capitalism flourishes? Why is it not in the East, in the cities? There's a frontier there, too. Furthermore, where are the Indians in all this? You don't seem to be taking them into account. Where are the Mexican Americans? Where's the Chinese in all this? This is a very white, Eurocentric thesis, if ever there was one. And so there are many to this day that say that the frontier thesis has great merits to it. Others say, it's bunk. But what Jackson Turner does is that he places the West into sort of a mythical part of the American mind, where we see the frontier not so much as a borderline between civilization and darkness. Instead, we see it as a boundary, a place of great change and exchange and so forth. It's where we get the idea of the Western, is the movies that we see, the cheap Westerns especially, are ones that really rely a great deal on the idea of Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. Authors begin to write about the West, like Willa Cather, who you see there. She's a frontier author. The myth of the West says, the lone cowboy. I'm the old cowhand on the Rio Grande. And, you know, the stoic, not very sociable cowboy. Well, all you had to do is see Clint Eastwood's old series Rawhide to realize that cowboys were not loners. They were a gregarious lot, as I said. And very little mention of the Indians. The Indians die off. And the Indians become almost like cannon fodder in Western movies until a movie called The Searchers come out in 1959. It's perhaps John Wayne's greatest movie, and in it you get to see that the Indians have a little beef, that the Indians have grievances for which they are being vicious and arrogant and so forth. So the Western myth has definitely still captures the imagination, and people, of course, grew up playing cowboys and Indians when they grew up, and which was a very racist game when you think about it, because the Indians were always the bad guys. Let's take a look at some of the great characters of the West. On the left is John Henry Holliday, called Doc Holliday, who was afflicted by tuberculosis, so he left his home in Georgia. He was a dentist. That's why he was called a doctor. But he did not practice his trade as a dentist. Instead, he became a gambler and a gunfighter. Died at the age of 36 years old in Denver, Colorado. And on his deathbed, he converted to the Catholic Church. On the right was Doc Holliday's self-declared one friend in the world, and that is Wyatt Earp, who was a member of the Earp family, older brothers and younger brothers as well. He became one of the great town tamers of Dodge City. Of course, he took part in the great fight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. I hope you all have seen Kurt Russell's movie Tombstone, which was rather accurate, I must say, in some ways. And Wyatt Earp died in 1929, and his pallbearers were all Western movie actors. On the left is Judge Roy Bean, the only law west of the Pecos. On the right, you see the Oklahoma land rush. When they opened up the Oklahoma Territory, they literally put a big rope along the boundary where the wagons were lined up, and those who were able to slip through past the rope and past the federal troops, they were called Sooners. Man on the left is John Wesley Hardin. He was so mean that one time he shot and killed a man in a room above him for snoring. He fired through the ceiling and he killed the man. That's how mean he was. In the middle is a man that you hear about every Christmas when you watch the Christmas Story movie with Ralphie. That's Black Bart. And Black Bart was considered to be the gentleman bandit who, when he robbed people on their trains, he said please and thank you and treated everybody with great courtesy. A less than courteous train robber that you see on the right is the infamous Jesse James, who along with his brother Frank went wild in Missouri and Kansas. They were Confederate officers and cavalrymen in the Civil War out in the West, and then they turned to train robbing before Jesse James got shot and killed in the back. On the left is young Henry McCarty, who took the name William F. Bonney, and people simply referred to him as Billy the Kid. And his erstwhile partner and later sheriff lawman Pat Garrett is the man who killed Billy the Kid. On the left is a man named Robert Leroy Parker, who took to cutting meat as a profession before he became a gunfighter and a bank robber. He took the name Butch, as in Butch Cassidy was his criminal name. And his partner on the right, the Sundance Kid, whose full name was Harry Alonzo Longabaugh. Eventually they went down to Bolivia, where they were reportedly killed in a bank heist. Here you see Buffalo Bill Cody, the great showman that he was, and he was incredibly talented and theatrical, and his Wild West show went all the way around the world, performed for kings and queens and czars and emperors and so forth. It was very popular, put on stage battles and buffalo drives and so forth. On the right, with his hand in his breast pocket, is Alan Pinkerton, a Scottish immigrant who created a detective agency that later took over the security for the President of the United States prior to the Secret Service. Here you see a poster for Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the World, a poster that went around. Whenever the poster went into big cities, people immediately flocked and got their tickets right away, sort of like a U2 concert would do today. The picture that Alan Pinkerton took with his classic Napoleonic pose was when he was with President Lincoln. And standing to the right of President Lincoln is a Union general by the name of John McClernand. This was a picture of Lakota Sioux Indian chiefs taken in around 1865 or 66. They were overly dressed for this occasion, and they did not do it by choice. You can tell the great dignity in their faces, but at the same time the sense of we're not too happy about things as they exist at this particular moment. Native Americans or American Indians have made great contributions in a variety of fields, especially sports. Jim Thorpe on the left was considered the greatest athlete of the United States. He played in the Olympics in 1912, winning the decathlon and the heptathlon. When he was presented his award by the King of Sweden, was presented to the King of Sweden, he said, "Thanks, King." In the middle is Billy Mills, a Kansas Indian who joined the Marine Corps, then qualified for the 10,000 in the Tokyo Olympics of 1964, and out of nowhere won the 10,000 meter and the gold medal. On the right is the first U.S. American Indian astronaut, Jack Armstrong, Colonel Jack Armstrong, who walked in space. Here you see the Buffalo Soldiers, the all-black cavalrymen who were tremendously feared but also respected by the Indians of the Great Plains. One of the reasons being is that they fought tenaciously but treated the Indians as captives much more gently than did white officers. Buffalo soldiers were prominent all the way through the Plains Wars and into the Spanish-American War. And again, it showed that African Americans were willing to serve the country that was their country of birth, even though they did not get full rights and privileges, because they felt that by doing so they would earn more respect and therefore more rights. The last picture you see here, I go back to the picture of Wyatt Earp that you see there, second from the left sitting. On the upper left is his good friend, Bat Masterson, that you see there. And on the right of Wyatt Earp, or your right of Wyatt Earp, is Bat's brother, Ed Masterson, who remained behind in Dodge City as Wyatt and Bat went off to other opportunities. Ed Masterson, unfortunately, was shot and killed trying to disarm a very rowdy, drunk cowboy in Dodge City. These are the cowboys, and these are the Native Americans that fought it out on the plains and the frontier and still occupy an important part of the American imagination.